Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Hi, Laura.
Hi, Iris. Nice to
How are
see
you?
you. Welcome. We are going to wait for a couple of more minutes to see if more people are joining. Meanwhile, this is going to be recorded, so feel free to turn on or off your camera as you wish. And if you want us to let us know where you are joining from, that would be nice. You can just tell us in the chat. We see Scotland, Portugal, Paris. So it's sunny in Aberdeen, but it's raining in Glasgow.
It's cold and raining in here in Ireland.
Oh, raining as well there. Wow. Sunny. I'm not going to ask in Cyprus how it is. Finland, wow, nice. So many people from so many places. Okay. Let's start. Come on. So, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today in the presentation of our newest study about the resilience of the craft sector. Can you hear me well? Or should I shout a bit? Okay, go ahead then. I'm Laura Miguel, Secretary General at Voce Europe. We are a non-profit network organization that promotes knowledge sharing, growth, and preservation and valorization of crafts. And working in collaboration with our member crafts organizations from across the European continent, we implement a spectrum of events, projects, and programs which highlight our mission to elevate awareness of crafts as an integral part of society's cultural, social, and economic well-being. We represent a network of currently 38 organizations from 23 European countries. This roundtable today is part of the New European Voce Festival, which takes place this week. In 2021, Workers' Council Europe became an official partner of the New European Voce. This initiative calls on all Europeans to imagine and build together a sustainable and inclusive future that is beautiful for our eyes, minds, and souls. As part of this project, Workers' Council Europe is developing a series of online webinars that will contribute to enhancing the capacities of the craft sector, to contribute to building more resilient and sustainable societies, and encourage the necessary adaptation of practices in the sector. So, in the scope of our work, we have identified the need of having updated and reliable data in order to draft our strategy according to the state of art of the craft sector and offer activities adapted to it. We have seen that the lack of appropriate data is also preventing the establishment of policies that favor the survival and competitiveness of the craft sector. In May 2022, we started the Crafting Project, which is co-funded by the Creative Hero program of the European Union, which has allowed us to plan a series of 5 studies in order to gain in-depth knowledge of the specific needs, challenges, characteristics, and vulnerabilities of the European craft sector all along the value chain. In autumn last year, we issued the first one of these studies about the European market for crafts, which is estimated to have approximately 153 million people and be worth 50 billion euros, which is quite an amazing number. This study, which I just mentioned, is available on our website, and we have also here today one of the researchers, Rosa. Hi, Rosa. Rosa Muñoz. And today we are happy to share with you the findings of our second study, which builds up on the one I just mentioned. And the idea is to have an insight to the main features, results, as well as recommendations of the study, and have an open discussion with all of you on what resilience is. That's why the format of this presentation is a meeting format and not a conference format in Zoom, so that you all can intervene. If you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat or raise your hand, and we will give you the chance to speak and ask questions and intervene as we are progressing with the presentation. So the current sector, the craft sector, is currently facing many challenges, starting with the effects of the COVID crisis, the shortage of raw materials, the war in Ukraine, which caused a rise in the energy prices, as well as other local or regional challenges. And we want to see today how the craft sector has overcome them, and see what the future looks like. Therefore, I would like to introduce you to the research team of the study. It was a team of 4 UK-based craft specialists, consultants, which are going to debate with us today. So we have Claire Arnott. We have as well Carol Sinclair today here on the screen. Hi, Claire. Hi, Carol. Sorry. We have Katia Stewart also here, and Helen Voce. So today they are going to present the main results of the study. So I'm going to stop here and give the floor to Katia, who's going to start. And if you want to share your screen, thank you, Katia.
Thanks. We did lots of screen sharing practice before this, so I've nailed it. Got it. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having us here. So as Laura said, we're the second of 5 studies, and we did our data collection and reporting last year. So we've all just gone through the process of reimbursing ourselves in all of the findings to talk to you today. So I'm Katia, as I said. I've worked in the craft sector for around 20 years, working in a lot of the craft support agencies based in the UK. So working at Craft Northern Ireland, Crafts Council, and managing the global craft programme Crafting Futures on behalf of British Council. And yeah, I was going to introduce Helen and Carol, but you've done that already for me, Laura, so I won't do that. So we're going to keep this really informal. I think each of us are going to go through some slides. We're going to spend about 10 minutes each, just looking at some of the interesting quotes and some of the interesting data that came out of the report, and some of the recommendations that we put forward as part of it. But we want to keep it light, and we'd love your input and love your questions, and hopefully turn this into a bit of a conversation between us and you. So with that, I'll get started. Has my slide moved? Great, just to double check. So in gathering data for our study, we conducted focus groups, interviews, and an anonymous online survey. We had 285 respondents from 25 European countries, which we actually split into 3 groupings, which you can see there on the screen. So craft makers made up 38%, which included craftspeople and artisans. The intermediaries that I mentioned there, that covers galleries, retailers, educators, and organisations. And then we called a group intermediary craft makers. So that's a combination of people who are doing both making and combining that with part-time work as an intermediary. The study's structure covers the challenges and opportunities, resilience and how it's understood and defined, and the future and future opportunities and needs for the sector. There were some limiting factors for the study, which were primarily language and translation, as well as timing and duration. Language, it was really tricky because obviously we were aware that we'd be isolating some people if we conducted it in English, but just the limitations of the budget meant that we had to do it in English, and we knew it was a widely spoken language for some people in Europe. But yeah, anecdotally, we were aware from some of the people that we spoke to that we were unable to speak to all the groups that we'd like to, just because of that language barrier. Okay, I'm gonna just jump slides. I've messed my notes up a little bit, so excuse me for a second. I'm just going to find my notes. Is it all right if I just pause one moment? Give me 1 second. Okay, so on timing, the primary data gathering phase for the study was actually, it fell just exactly as we were hitting kind of summer holiday period in Europe. So that made it quite tricky for us to track everybody down. We spent quite a lot of time kind of chasing people and following up, and a lot of organizations were on a holiday period. So we struggled a little bit with that. And of course there were just reduced opportunities to engage with an already stretched sector to kind of amplify our study from a kind of organizational perspective. And then the duration, we sort of felt mostly during that primary data gathering phase that we extended the period of the survey, so it sort of ate into our time for analysing the data, so that was a bit tricky as well, so some limiting factors there. We wanted to ensure that there was a breadth of representation, and we decided to split our response groupings, as I've already mentioned there. So craft makers, intermediaries, and intermediary craft makers. And our strategy for gathering representation across the European area was to ensure that we were covering countries that weren't previously represented in the first report commissioned by World Crafts Council Europe. But also focusing on a kind of rural, rural and island voices, just to make sure that they were included alongside those kind of bigger, more populated voices from bigger and more populated areas. In terms of our respondents profile, we had a high proportion of intermediary craft makers, making up almost, as you can see, almost 50% of our respondents. But we didn't explore, I suppose we didn't have a capacity to explore whether this mix of structure of working made them more resilient than, say, pure craft makers. But it was interesting to see that having a mix of work available to them extended that sense of community and that sense of support. And we were also really aware that probably those who aren't resilient have stopped their craft, and so they weren't, of course, responding to our survey. And we did hear that from some of those people that we spoke to. We wanted to structure our survey so that it was very kind of qualitative, data-led, providing a platform for some of the voices that we heard from and some of the really very powerful things that they had to say to us. Some people shared some really difficult stories of struggle and hardship, and we found people to be really, really honest and transparent in the survey. And maybe they painted slightly a more negative picture of how things were. And then through the interviews and the focus groups, we kind of got a more rounded picture and a fuller story of how people have adapted and demonstrated those aspects of resilience that we've listed and we'll talk about a bit later on. So just a little bit more on the profile and where they're from and ages. It encompassed more than the 20 European countries in which World Crafts Council Europe members are located. We reached those in the EU 27 countries, the EU candidate countries and beyond, who've not previously been involved in World Crafts Council Europe activity and research. We engaged countries in which the research team has existing networks and contacts. And we wanted to build a data set which could be segmented by geography, so variations in location could be further explored. And in terms of craft, it's not listed on the screen here, but a large proportion of respondents were working in either textiles or ceramics. Age range, we had a balance of age ranges represented across all age groups, with the highest response in the category of 56 to 70 years old. And we didn't capture any data of anyone under the age of 20. So I hope you don't look at this as a very kind of UK perspective. Maybe when I explain more, you'll see why I've put this quote on the screen. Our study covered the exploration of the impact of COVID-19 and the cost of living crisis and the impact this has had on supply chain. We talked quite a lot with craft makers about their supply chain, and we were surprised by on how many levels and in how many different countries this was felt. Supply chain issues that might have begun during COVID-19 were exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. 39% across all groups reported increased costs as an impact. And the cost of living crisis also exacerbated that too. And we were a little surprised to hear that Brexit has also impacted supply chain problems across Europe, and the demand for craft products has been significantly affected by new tariffs and taxes. And probably mostly for me, I mean, I can't speak for the other researchers, but I was quite surprised, certainly by this quote on the screen, just how much of a loss Brexit has meant for this particular craft person, because it's not only impacted the craft sector in the UK, but those who are based elsewhere in Europe, who were previously easily able to access materials, services, events, training, work opportunities, labour, and more in the UK. So I just wanted to speak briefly about personal challenges and resilience, and that sort of triple threat of all these things that have happened. Across all groups, 62% highlighted that personal challenges had a big or significant impact. And of the 32% that indicated that there was a significant impact from personal challenges, 53% of those went on to say their resilience has changed in the past 5 years, and that they felt much more or a little bit more resilient. So despite the hard times, they've become more resilient after weathering the storms and coming out still standing in the end. And I'd say, considering what respondents presented as challenges and opportunities from the last 5 years, we were quite surprised to see how resilient the sector was and how resilient it had remained in general, with a high percentage of respondents indicating that they are a little or much more resilient over the last 5 years. I'd say most notable was the craft makers group, with 32% feeling much more resilient, despite being very vocal in the survey and in the focus groups about the various challenges that they'd faced. So I'm just going to speak a little bit about the future. So the loss of craft education across all stages of learning was felt to be a significant issue, and considered by respondents to be the biggest threat to the craft sector in the future. There were also some other areas that were highlighted in terms of the future, including needing to preserve craft heritage and identity and skills and knowledge, a requirement for creative and business development, especially in digital sales and marketing skills, public education to facilitate greater knowledge and appreciation of craft, so educating those audiences a lot more. International opportunities for knowledge exchange, collaborations and residencies, support to grow local, national and international networks, and investment into the craft sector infrastructure, and finally sympathetic tax regimes and economic development policies that support craft makers. So despite the very significant challenges faced by the sector, we found that they were all still pretty positive. You know, we had some really tough conversations with people, but on the flip side of that, they all still had something positive to say. 52% of our respondents felt quite or very positive about the future of the next 5 years. And the key reasons for that were increased consumer interest in craft alongside those new digital routes to market, refreshed business models and resilient behaviours. I'm going to stop there on the positive note. It's quite a nice positive note to end on. And I'm going to hand over to Carol now. Hopefully that gives you a kind of overview of some of the data and a picture of what we experienced. But all of this, of course, is in the report. So Carol, over to you.
I think we're actually just going to take questions.
Oh, sorry. Oh, we were going to pause for questions, weren't we? Yes, apologies, my fault. I'll stop sharing because then it's easier for me to see everybody's faces.
We can have questions now or at the end. I don't know if anyone wants to ask anything.
Yeah, maybe.
Or maybe once everyone has gone through, then we'll have more questions.
We can hold them for the end. It doesn't look like there's anybody like waving, desperate to ask a question. Oh wait, you're waving.
Yes. Elizabeth has a question.
Also question, right? So this is so interesting, actually. maybe you said and I wasn't listening, so my apologies if you did say, what was the population tested, what in numbers?
What was this? Sorry, I couldn't
The
hear.
population size for your survey in numbers?
We had 285 respondents on the survey.
So over all these countries, right?
Yes. Oh, I don't think I told you.
I mean, I'm sorry, you probably did say, but I didn't catch it at the time.
Well, it was more than 20 European countries, more than the 20 that the World Crafts Council Europe work within. And we extended that to more countries that we had networks within already.
Okay.
I don't know, Carol, Helen, if you can remember it off the top of your head, because I can't.
It's just to try and gauge like how important are some of the numbers really.
I think it's a good question, Elizabeth, because I think we were hoping for like a bigger sample size so that we could have, we could test more of our what maybe we came into with some questions, or maybe the ones that would come our way. And like Katia was saying, the timing wasn't brilliant in terms of the reach, but all the World Crafts Council Europe members were brilliant at kind of putting the extra newsletter out, sending the email,
it's very
social
hard
media.
to get results.
Yeah. So I think in a way, like, it's not even like the tip of an iceberg. It's kind of like a dot in the ocean to be able, and I think, quite a lot of what we present could really be, kind of taken into a separate study or challenged, particularly by like a country or even one of the members. And that is one of the things that we suggest as a recommendation, is how does some of our findings sit alongside findings that people have maybe done locally. So we had hoped for a bigger sample size. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it still is very, very interesting, but it's good to put it in the context, so we know if it's 100% of one person, you have to take it with a pinch of salt. Yeah, thank you very much. That's great.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for your question. Nikki, you have also one question?
I think it was just building on Elizabeth's point, and I think that it's so interesting seeing the data come through from the studies, and I think we have to recognise it's a teeny tiny sample, as Helen said, but it's absolutely echoing, I think, the conversations we're probably having on a much broader basis with our own networks and communities. So I think being able to use this as an articulation of this, of the what we're hearing across that is a really useful, solid base to which to be able to build on. And I think that recommendation to take this further within our own spaces is such an important one. So I'm making so many notes, guys. It's brilliant. Thank you so much.
Can I just respond to Nikki? Because I think one of the things that we found, or I suppose when I talk about the recommendations, is like everything from the first study was so, you could just port it over into this study. And all the work that the World Crafts Council Europe had done already, with the manifesto and the action plan and, situating. So it felt positive on positive to be doing that, but then also that intrepidation of, okay, how do we go beyond the echo chamber to tell other people, to kind of do that reach, really. So the first study, really helped, particularly with they did a great SWOT analysis within the market for European craft. So when you read the report, you'll see we reference that quite a lot, but it was useful because it's a real foundation at the beginning of this series of five studies. So yeah.
Can I just chip in too that, I think there's survey fatigue out there. There's been so many requests for people to fill in surveys, particularly in reference to what people have been going through with COVID and cost of living crisis, etc. And obviously we were asking some of the same questions, but we were trying to extrapolate that into the positives of resilience. So I suppose it's just maybe a plea to the people out there to fill in surveys, because without the data, it's very hard to make arguments. So yeah, please always fill in a survey if you can spare 10 minutes. It's really appreciated.
Thank you, Carol, Helen, and Nikki. We have one more question from Katia from Cyprus, and then I would like us to go ahead, because you anticipated we have recommendations, we have more outcomes from the study, which are really interesting to share. So Christina from Cyprus is asking, I just wanted to ask whether you got more or less positivity for the future from the younger participants versus the older participants. Do you have some data on that?
I don't think that those are some of the numbers that we crunched together, if you like, or compared. But anecdotally, I would say from everything that I read and the conversations that we had, I didn't perceive that either grouping was more positive or less positive than the other. I felt that even, you know, there were some older respondents they'd been through a lot, had weathered a lot of storms, had a lot of personal challenges, that still felt very positive about the future. There were some younger craftspeople who were kind of coming into it as knowing that it's a difficult place to work and a difficult thing to do, but choosing it as a lifestyle choice and knowing what they were doing and still feeling positive about it. Helen, Carol, I don't know if you have thoughts.
Yeah, I think just echoing what you say, Katia, it's just surprising and reassuring and to hear that there's still such positivity despite some really complicated situations that people find themselves in.
Okay, Carol, do you want to share your screen and we'll...
Okay. Yeah, I'll pick up the conversation about what resilience actually is and looks like for the sector. So can everybody see my screen okay? Yep.
Yes, we can.
Excellent, excellent. Well, firstly, I just want to set the scene a little bit. I'm Carol. I'm a ceramic artist and I've been running my own practice for 33 years. But for the last 20 or so, I've actually been one of those intermediary craft makers that we've just talked about, because I do business advising, I do project management, I do research into the craft sector. And I was really struck by actually how many other people do that. And so I do, from a personal point of view, think that it does add to resilience, not just because you've got different elements of income generation, but also because being out there and meeting other people, you know, when you work on your own is a really important element of building community and recognizing and creating opportunities. So for me, that was a really interesting observation. And then I think just picking up on what Katia's been saying about the need to ask questions about the last 5 years was really important to then be able to put a context for resilience in place. As Katia said, we heard that a lot of people had left the sector, but then we'd also heard about new people entering the sector. So I do think that the respondents were people who were well placed to talk about resilience, and they certainly gave us really rich feedback. We wanted to start the process and discussion by providing a definition of resilience. And the one we've got here, as you can see at the top of the screen, is being able to successfully adapt to difficult or challenging life experiences through flexibility and being able to adjust to changing demands. And we had very deliberately taken quite a neutral approach to that definition. We didn't want to provide any sort of craft context. We wanted it to be quite generic. And we wanted it to be something that people could just use as a starting point for their own reflections and thoughts. And we did ask people if they agreed with that definition, and by and large they did. Although what I wanted to do was share this quote from someone who said it was actually much more basic and simple. It was about just not giving up on what you want to do. And that actually was a very strong theme throughout the responses, that people just were very driven to continue to do what they do and find ways to make that possible. But I want to share with you the next quote, which says, to accept to give up sometimes when it doesn't work, let it go. And that might seem that it's absolutely at odds with that first quote. But actually, I think it's very much part of the same spectrum, that it's about having a determination and a long-term plan, but it's also being flexible enough to be able to recognize when you need to change direction. And that was sort of it might be about the way that you run your practice, the type of work you make. I know as a ceramist, sometimes you're experimenting and trying to make clay do things that it just doesn't want to do, and sometimes you have to give into it. It has a strong will. But I think for the study, it was primarily the ability to change and reassess the marketplace. Obviously, over the last 5 years, the markets have changed significantly. Opportunities for selling have changed, but that's not new. You know, that has been certainly more extreme in the last 5 years. But as someone who's been running my craft practice a long time, you have to constantly, as a maker, reassess the direction you're taking. So those are sort of characteristics that a lot of people talked about and shared with us. But another extremely strong element of response was about sense of purpose. So that real sense of something that gets you up in the morning and something that helps you through the really difficult times was a very strong theme. But actually where that sense of purpose came from was a little bit different from different makers. It did sort of fall into some categories quite naturally. And I'm sharing quotes here from a heritage craft provider in Romania who talked very passionately about resilience being in perfect harmony with the environment and having that sort of sustainable approach to practice. Very much the idea that you should take the resources you need, but you should leave enough to replenish, and that you should leave resources for others to take as well. And they were very clear that that was something very strong within rural communities, but it's not just rural communities that need to work in a sustainable way, but also those working in urban environments need to be thinking about resources as well. So the environmental element was very strong in a lot of makers and respondents and some of our organisations as well. But another feature was the role of craft in identity, and that sense of having a responsibility to pass on skills. We spoke to members of the Sami community in the north of Sweden, and they talked a lot about the responsibility they felt to pass on the skills that they had learned from their families, and that in fact they talked about craft being a provider of resilience, which was a really interesting sort of twist on the conversation we had with other people. So that real sense of craft as identity and responsibility was a really strong driving force with quite a few makers. And then for some people, it was just simply the passion of making, the joy of getting up in the morning, getting into your studio and continuing to develop your skills and your ideas. And that was often the sort of addiction that kept people going, the need to get better and explore and continue to develop their skills. So I think for us, we in the report, we have a lot of quotes because we got some really rich information, very personal, very individual information from people. So please do read through. There's lots of really interesting takes on our themes that we've shared. But we also wanted to bring these elements of resilience into a number of sort of key components that relate specifically to the craft sector, the attitudes and skills and infrastructure that it needs. So just going through those quickly for you. The first one, the purpose-driven, we've talked about already. The second one, very much about having confidence and needing confidence in your making skills and knowledge to know that you've got something worthwhile and something you're proud and happy to share. Also, this idea of exercising long-term thinking, very much about looking at long-term planning, you know, a few years ahead, maybe decades ahead, where you're keen to continue to work in the sector. And that ability to use your long-term thinking to enable you to navigate short-term obstacles. And having that flexibility and readiness to adapt that we've already talked about, the ability to pivot as we've been talking a lot about in recent years. The fifth point, having problem-solving skills and optimistic thinking patterns. It's a really interesting combination there because it's the optimism in knowing there will be a solution that keeps people going, And obviously, craft is a daily exercise in problem solving, so those skills are in abundance. The personal characteristics that came through really summed up in point 6 about determination, doggedness, bravery, and inner strength. I really particularly love the idea of the bravery, but absolutely strong personal skills that people kind of associated a lot with that purpose-driven aspect as well. Point 7, the resourcefulness and ingenuity, was really around the idea of the nimbleness of small business, of having independence and autonomy that would allow you and enable you to be resourceful and apply resources where you needed them. The combined and transferable creative and business skills, it was really important to think about these two things as being completely intermingled. The idea that you needed both of those things was a strong element, and that one recognized the other. I think perhaps in craft, more than perhaps other art forms, you know, craftspeople really see themselves as businesses, but with strong creative elements to that. The 9th point about community and ecosystem, things that, you know, I've talked about personally being important, but a lot of other people did too, that opportunity for exchange, collaboration, just even encouragement, and the importance when you are working by yourself to have other people to talk to who understood. And the 10th one about taking a lifelong learning approach to developing your skills. So sort of hand in hand with that long-term thinking, but this is very much about dedicated lifelong learning, to knowing that it will take patience and perseverance to actually develop your skills to a stage of mastery, and everybody sort of keen to keep going until they really got to grips with what they wanted to do. So I would say that those 10 were very much around the makers themselves, the characteristics of the makers, and the skills that they've developed. But the 11th point, really important and very much about the intermediaries that we spoke to, is having an accessible infrastructure and mechanisms for support. So business support, creative development, funding, all these things were really important for the longevity of the sector. And one of the strongest bits of feedback was that there was a real concern that in recent years that infrastructure has started to diminish for a number of reasons, mostly funding, and that was something that needed to be addressed very urgently. So I'm gonna stop there, because I think that is a point that Helen will pick up in our recommendations. But I'll stop sharing my screen so that we can just have a little bit of a chat about resilience.
I don't know, Helen, if you want to go ahead and we have the chat afterwards when we have the full picture of the study.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, that's okay. Oh, Elizabeth.
Can I say something? I'm sorry, I always have something to say. Yeah, I was looking at, so the first point about I mean, I call it as a goal. I've always been very purpose driven. And for me, it's not so much like how, I don't start with the how do I do this? It's like, I want to do this no matter how. So in some respect, the circumstances are not that important, because I will find a way, you know, to get there. And I think quite a lot of craft people function that way. They have this ultimate goal. And I think both COVID and Brexit are bombers, but you just get through it. So, but also the point about community, I thought that was something Applied Arts Scotland addressed really well, although I didn't interpret it at the time. But the creating the Zoom sessions during the lockdowns was an absolute brilliant moment, when we met regularly online with people I could never meet normally, but I felt really supported during that time. So, you know, thank you very much for that, because that was absolutely top to be kept going, and also to get over the overwhelming effect of the lockdown. So I think the community is very, very important. Yeah, these are really great points.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. I mean, we did have a lot of respondents that said things like, I just have to do it. And
Yeah.
somebody said, you know, I'm getting older and I'm losing time and I've got to get into the studio even more. You know, they're just complete commitment, which was so amazing to hear and speak about.
Yeah, I think if anything at all, COVID gave me this like complete focus. This is where I'm going, and you know, nobody is going to stop me in some respect to do it. COVID did change my life and my practice completely, 100% for the best, for the best. With
There's
a lot of support from friends and
there was
community.
something I was going to just pick up on between what Carola talked about and what I'm going to talk about, which was we asked in the survey what the key skills in craft practice, business or organization associated with resilience was. And the top one across all the different types of respondents was problem solving skills. So actually that really talks to what, you know, kind of what you're saying, what Carol's saying, and then craft making skills was the next one. You know, it wasn't kind of money or business skills, or it was kind of, you know, the need to get to the destination, to, you know, to move there. And the other thing that made me think of is in the European Market for Craft report is they talk about craft thinking and how you can, you know, if you know what design thinking is and that iterative process, it talks about how that craft thinking, that logic is mapped by makers onto their practice to get to the, you know, to solve the challenge, to tackle the challenge through adapting how they make or the knowledge that they have into, you know, whether it's a partnership, a commission, a product. So we feel, and again, maybe we're talking to the converted, that, you know, that's definitely, you know, a strength within our sector that we can take forward. Yeah, Kate, if you read the European Market for Craft report, it talks about craft thinking in there, and it's a small piece, but for me it really resonated. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? So I wonder if any of your reports and so on, technology is one of the factors that you're using to analyze all this. So I'll explain why. I had a failed business in the 1990s where I had to put down a business into liquidation. It was a craft business I was making. I ran out of money. I let it go. Today, I wouldn't. I would find a way to keep it going. And I feel like the online community is really supporting me a lot of the time. In the 90s, there wasn't such a thing, and I felt very, very isolated. And I think for me, the big difference between my younger years as a craft person and my now years is the online. So the access to groups like this where we can meet up, but also my daily kind of, you know, Instagramming where people put likes, and that really boosts your confidence kind of thing. So I wonder if part of the resilience, there is a little bit of this support that we are getting through this online access of our village, our tribe, our people who are supporting us. I think that's very important, that maybe if you haven't lived through both, you don't really realize, you know, it's just what happens now. But if you've lived a similar experience in the past when you were very isolated geographically, then it might, you know, you really see the difference. So.
Laura, I don't know if you want to say anything about the digital plans.
Well, we are doing a new report based on that, on how digitalization is helping, or well, is touching the craft sector, and how the craft sector can benefit from it. So we're going to publish it this year. So yeah, I just recommend you to stay tuned and watch when we publish it. And I think, Helen, no, yeah, it's your turn, huh? Maybe you share the more outcomes and the recommendations of the report, and then I would really like to have a discussion, because the chat is really active and people are sharing their experiences. And yeah, please, Helen, if you.
Okay,
Oh,
great.
already the conclusion.
Yeah, sorry, but straight to the conclusion. I'll go through this quite quickly because I think Katia and Carol have spoken, you know, kind of concluded the chapters essentially. And the conclusion in itself is quite brief in terms of pulling together the key things. But if I run through it, then maybe it'll entice you to go back and read the report, the different elements. And maybe just for context, my name's Helen Voce, and I'm an intermediary. I'm a lapsed craft maker. I studied hands-on making at college, and then dropped that and find it easier or healthier or more rewarding to support those who make and get, help them get to where they want to go to. So the study's findings demonstrated how strongly the sector's been impacted by the past 5 years. I mean, I think it was a bit of a rock and a hard place to do the study when we did it, because you could see that there was this, kind of build-up of, challenge behind people, and they were in challenge and they could see it coming in terms of the cost of living, the war in Ukraine, etc. So, navigating that was very interesting. And like Katia said, we had a lot of people that were very honest and shared very, very challenging and emotional circumstances with us. And we're grateful for people's honesty. But as a research team, we were really struck with that undeniable positivity that emanated from the people we spoke to, and that as makers, whether it was, like a personal quality that they always had, whether it was within them, part of their practice, or something that they developed over time, they were hardy, they were strong-willed, they were driven to continue despite the challenges that were there. And actually, like Carol said with the definition, some people didn't recognize the word resilience when we used it. They would use a term like survive or just keep going. And so actually speaking to people was really useful, because they would then kind of go, oh, I'll take that term and I'll apply it to me. So that was quite useful. And we understood that that this tenacity of particularly the craft makers, but also the intermediaries, it came from a place of deep passion for what they did, their craft, their skills, their making, the heritage that they may be part of, and a number of people could situate themselves in a continuum of their practice, of their craft, and what that meant in terms of them as an individual doing that, whether it was about preservation of a family skill, or kind of transmitting that onto others. And most people just simply loved what they were doing. But what was clear is, whether we had a positivity that came from a negative situation, is that was at a cost, and people's reserves were low. Their health, their families, their finances, that kind of precipice, that precarity of kind of, like, I don't know whether we can take another challenge, or, kind of they could gauge, like they almost had like a barometer of what size the challenge would be, that they'd be able to tackle. I guess a bit like Elizabeth was saying, is they've gotten to know themselves a bit more through particularly COVID, but then also some of the other challenges. And the evidence showed us that the craft sector is really in need of this infrastructure that we talked about. And again, I think most people in the room would be aware of that. And personally, I'm very grateful for what the World Crafts Council Europe are doing in terms of their bigger work, but these 5, this collection of studies to gather the data, to gather evidence that we as either individuals or members or non-members can use to make the arguments to really, build a foundation under how we communicate with those in authority or positions of power or decision makers to kind of support that. And all the groups that we spoke to had this perception that craft is undervalued, it's underinvested in, and it's misunderstood. And like I say, really wanted to activate some of this knowledge. So it's great to be able to share that with you today, and for you to read the report. The challenges that the sector faced in the past 5 years had been impacted by routes to market. So galleries and outlets we knew were closing. The perceived unstable economy had quite a lot of risk-averse buyers, although I think if you kind of, once we come out of COVID, thinking of markets like Collect, which was in London in February, I think it was, you could see that those that have deep pockets will always have deep pockets. They're there, but if they're diminishing, or they're harder to reach, or they're saturated, there's a real change in how we communicate with clients. The saturated online marketplace, that is an area where we saw people were adopting technology. Not everyone could do it because they didn't necessarily have the hardware, they didn't have the connectivity, they didn't have the skills, and the digital skills is one of the recommendations that we make. But the respondents were also able to articulate that the various crises had allowed them time and support for creative and business development. So that was particularly evident with those who had access to a private workshop. So maybe it was in their home or on their land, they weren't restricted by others. Those that were maybe able to access funding, a number of countries spoke about having grants to support people through COVID, whether that was something they could get direct from the government, the local government, or whether it's something they accessed through an intermediary, that the intermediary had made the case to support others. So some people had used that as an opportunity to really push their creative practice or absorb themselves in it, but it wasn't true for everybody. And a bit like Elizabeth was saying there about the rethinking what the provision was, whether it was products or services, skills or teaching, and how they structure their business or the services that are responding to that changing environment. So I have to keep clicking on different screens. And like Katia said, there were no European areas or countries that stood out as more resilient than others. And I think for us as a research team, and we acknowledge a bias in all four of us are UK based. I think up until that point, most of us had worked on projects beyond Europe. So for me, this was a project where I'd been the closest to the European craft sector, full stop. Usually been working on the Crafting Futures project in different parts of the world. So it was really interesting to speak about how there was resonance of different elements across the craft sector, and that the similarities, commonalities were felt by those practitioners and the intermediaries that support them. And the sector is in fact resilient and has remained so through the most difficult of times. But without that investment, we can't be certain about how resilient it would remain should there be another 5 years of challenges, like I said. So just quickly through our recommendations, we made 6, and they're after the conclusion in the study, and they align with the World Crafts Council Europe's the crafting projects, which this is the second study within, and the Crafting Europe Manifesto and Action Plan. So the first one was to keep talking about resilience. I think for us, this was very much driven by that the term not being immediately recognized. So if it's a term we could use, if we could adopt within the sector, then we could do that. And we talked about kind of suggesting that it gets woven into different elements of the work that we're doing. And we definitely had a positive response to the definition. Like I said, people kind of going, oh yeah, I am that. I'll kind of adopt that into my practice. And very much about supporting people where their personal reserves were diminishing. The personal and business challenges were very present. And also recognizing those 11 characteristics that Carol shared to demonstrate this aspect of resilience. The second one, I mean, this really doesn't do justice to the scale of what this could be, but education, it just kept coming up. Formal, informal, access, routes, visibility, skills, teaching, preservation, retention, cultural heritage. It was very much at the time when, the geographical indicators are being explored. So, it sits very well in this space. So it's definitely needed. It's an enormous task, but we thought it was a, clear and prevalent identified need for it, with concerns about loss of craft education and training, and a lack and loss of the skilled labour, and also an urgent need for new skills to be developed to support craft businesses to operate successfully now and in the future. So how do we support people to be resilient going into what we don't know is next, that kind of future-proofing? The third recommendation is for the continued support, networking and opportunities that's responsive, iterative and pervasive. There was a pressing and urgent need from the makers and the intermediaries who support them to be connected and have mobility locally, nationally and internationally. And like Katia was saying, I think for us, it based in the UK to hear that, you know, kind of noise from Europe about Brexit limiting, and it's limiting, you know, both ways. And this need for mobility and to connect, to talk, to exchange, to respond, to learn. We feel it's very necessary and should really be supported to foster the sector's collective desire for development and to, you know, to demonstrate that idea of resilience. And then the fourth one was the craft sector infrastructure and value. And that relates specifically to the crafting project, the series of studies. We felt that these studies are really leading the way in representing and being a voice of the craft sector in Europe. And as I mentioned earlier, can really be something we can, you know, we can tune into to support the arguments or cases or, you know, kind of that we're making in different parts of Europe. So I would really encourage you to get familiar with these reports, look out for the next 3 that are coming up. Funding, it's 5 out of 6, but it's still very important. In terms of the economic crisis, the reliance on funding is adding further to that uncertainty and precarity. But there were aspects of craft practice and associated support structures that are in immediate danger of permanent loss and need to be addressed as a funding priority. So looking at recent global challenges, we can learn from and about alternative models. And we were just discussing that before we came onto the Zoom call. So we recommend actively coordinating lobbying for financial support at local and national levels, and includes advocacy for European-wide programs of support for the craft sector, such as Horizon, with World Crafts Council Europe, you know, acting as a representative body. And then the final one kind of echoes one of the earlier ones, which is just let's activate and interact with the research. And one of the things that we would love the World Crafts Council Europe members to do is understand how this research sits alongside, you know, kind of real snapshot surveys they were doing during COVID. How can these sit together? Because as we've said, we were aware our sample group was small. We were aware that we had, you know, very quick turnaround surveys that were done during COVID, that were done in response to the cost of living crisis. And that also meant that they weren't very comparable, but how can we use, you know, how can we situate 2 pieces of research to support those people to go further? And then it was just a thanks, really, to conclude, to say thank you to the World Crafts Council for the opportunity to undertake the research. I think for the team, we felt this quite qualitative study suited who we are and how we work in the sector. So thanks to the board members and all the members that spoke to us. Thanks to the wonderful team, Laura, Rachel, Anna and Julie. They were very understanding and responsive when we needed to kind of pivot or change, or they needed to read some drafts for us. But most importantly, it was all the makers, all the intermediaries, all the craft maker intermediaries who responded to the survey, like Carol said, during the survey fatigue, who came to the interviews that we held and who also came to the focus groups. We wish we could have done more of those, but you know, we did what we did in the time, and we've got what we've got. And like I say, it's a jumping off point, and we hope you enjoy the read.
Thank you so much, Helen. Wonderful presentation from all of you, Carol, Katia, and Helen. I just, well, we're running out of time, but I don't want to stop here. I see that in the chat there is a really ongoing conversation about the importance of networking, collaborating, sharing. People are asking to continue sharing and examples. And I want to, if nobody wants to ask directly now, I want just to ask you if when doing the study, you came across some projects or initiatives that people can explore further from now on, like, I don't know, fresh ideas, inspirational ideas, projects that you came across?
On
Any
the
one
subject
you?
of on the subject of networking, we had an Irish contribution to our focus groups, and there seemed to be an appetite there for creating an international network. So we sent that particular participant off with the tasked with the idea of actually getting that going, and we haven't heard back from her, so we may have to chase that one up. But there was a real appetite for this sort of opportunity for international networking, and I think that, you know, it's one of the positives of coming out of COVID, that we are all more comfortable now with this online way of working, which can facilitate that kind of thing. So although I don't have a name, I'm going to chase it up and I'll let you know.
Okay, thank you so much. Anyone wants to ask something? Otherwise, Maurice, yeah, you want to say?
Hi. Just very briefly, it's a great piece of work. Well done on the researchers that put it together. I think it'll make a huge contribution to better understanding about the economic and the social impact of the craft sector across Europe, because it is kind of hard to find a good, hard, factual information. The sector, you know, depends on each country, whatever it is, but it's difficult to get sort of good, quantifiable information like that. And also from a qualitative point of view, to describe the actual consumers and buyers, their requirements. I thought it was an excellent piece of work. However,
Yes.
not to be a party pooper, I've been working here with the Craft Council and with some smaller producers about this new geographic indication legislation. And it's kind of like the elephant in the room. It didn't, it wasn't touched on in your survey. Maybe that's for timing reason or whatever, but the legislation is coming into force shortly in Europe. Now, maybe the fact that as Britain is outside Europe, I'm not sure that would have influenced your decision not to include the topic, because I know Laura and I and a number of other craft producers around Europe are deep in discussion with the Commission and with EU IPO about how it's going to be implemented. But just as a kind of a reaction to that, we're looking on this as kind of a major geopolitical event, getting recognition for the craft sector and for industrial products, which heretofore have not been given any sufficient airtime. It was all about agricultural products. So we're kind of, I suppose, in the middle of this change that's taking place. We're very optimistic about it. Again, I'm not sure how that's going to impact in the UK. Maybe you have a different system or you have a parallel system that you're going to introduce as well. But just, sorry, I'm just throwing those out as kind of general comments. But no, overall, an excellent piece of work. Well done.
I can respond quickly to that in that in the study we did cite the World Crest Council Europe's response to the consultation on the geographical indicators, because I think at the time we did it, so we submitted in October, but essentially we'd wrapped up our research, you know, kind of end of August really. So I think there's definitely been development since then. So it would be interesting, and I think the reflection that I take on that, the position I take on it is, with Westminster just about to ratify the UNESCO Convention on Safeguarding in the UK in June, I think, of this year, is I feel like from my context in the UK, we're probably even further behind slightly with that. So we're kind of running to catch up a bit on some of those things, but it does feel, and the other point I was going to make is the geographical indicators did come up in some of the interviews, but it was mostly with the intermediaries. The makers weren't talking about it. You know, they didn't necessarily bring that to the fore. It's maybe not a term or a language that, you know, that they would use, really. So yeah.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Floriana, you raised your hand. Please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I hope you hear me. First of all, I apologize because I missed the beginning of this roundtable, but whilst following up the second part when I join you and looking at the chat, I see that the lifelong learning and the educational part is quite predominant, which is very, very important. It's something that is quite obviously recurrent. I work for the European Training Foundation, which is focusing mainly on skills and lifelong learning, of course, and among the different sectors, obviously craft is one of them. But I just wanted to mention, let's say, a little work that we did in order to visualize a little bit what could be the skills for the future needs in such a sector. And we did this through a journey that is basically a methodology that pushes you to think about what it could be the situation in a long term. We took 2050. We invited practitioners and people that are active in the field. And of course, among what it is very important, there are, of course, different factors. Education and reskilling, also in the light of the twin transitions, so digital and green, it is a must. But of course, in order also to promote those things, there is need for data availability, which are lacking a little bit in different terms, geographically. Sometimes it's really difficult to pack evidence that will then shake and motivate players at governance, because there is a reinforcement in terms of engagement at governance level that needs to be done. And at the same time, I mean, among the different, let's say, issue that we were tapping on, there were also others that I just heard, like introducing some economic incentive, because otherwise, if we don't make it sustainable, it will be very difficult to preserve the sector. And also to keep an eye on the quality, because in an era where there is this fast producing and reproducing, it is really, really difficult to keep up in the appreciation of unicity of certain craft products, which bring along a lot of, obviously, let's say, cultural heritage, of course, and go to tap not only in the sector of craft, because it has to be seen in terms of economic spin-off, also something that matches very well with the tourism sector. So trying to enlarge a little bit the vision in that sense. If you let me, I would like to share the publication that is, let's say, a bit of a narrative of this journey that we did, with a bit of a summary of the findings. So if you have the time to have a look on it, I would like to share it. And I will close my intervention here, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Floriana. Indeed, the craft sector, we are many stakeholders and we all do what we can. And this is so nice to network all together. And we do a piece of work, ETF does another piece of work. So it's good that we all contribute to this and have data, which is very important, data and prove how the sector of the craft sector is doing. And we, as Floriana said, we need to provide this information to the policymakers. And in that sense, picking up with what Mary said before, we established a working group on the geographical indications. And last week we were in Brussels. We met with the MEP, who is the rapporteur on this topic, with the EUIPO, the European Intellectual Property Office, which is going to implement the geographical indications at the European level. So we are trying to liaise with all these stakeholders and people, and we are transmitting all the needs and challenges and all this data gathered through this service that we are doing, and also others are doing, is very important to really defend, share what the craft sector is challenging at this time. We are really sorry, we run out of time, and I think we should keep this discussion, because I think you all have so many ideas and experiences that we should be sharing, but we need to stop at a certain point, because otherwise it's going to be very long. So I just wanted to say that the team and the board of Voce Central Europe wants to thank the team that undertook this study for giving us evidence and data on how the craft sector is facing the current challenges and how to extract learnings from there, because I think it's very important to extract the learnings. And this study has showed us a lot of interesting views on the craft sector and how resilient it is and what resilience means. We also want to thank you, the audience, for contributing to this debate today and for the future as well. Remember to follow us on social media and register to our newsletter to be aware of the latest news of the crafts. There we will be updating you on all, well, we always share the stories from others, craft activities, events that are happening all around Europe. And at last, I would like you to invite you to the next webinar in the framework as well of the New European Bauhaus Festival that is taking place this week as well on Wednesday at 5 p.m. Central European Time. We'll be talking about responsible futures, about innovation and experimentation in the craft sector. If you want to join us, we are going to, well, Rachel already shared link on it. So that's all from our side, and thank you so much and have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.